Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. What's a fool look like? No one wants to be thought a fool, but sometimes foolishness looks sensible at the time. 1 Samuel 13 is a case study, and it's a bit uncomfortable. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. What does a fool look like? When you think of the word fool, you might picture a court jester or a person that you might remember from school who everyone laughed at, or a workmate or even a rival who just never seems to get it. Let me tell you a quick story. Back in the day, I used to do rock climbing and abseiling and caving, and one of my mates who I used to do this with was a top student who was really very smart. Now, one day, a group of us found this great overhang and decided to use a climbing rope to abseil. A climbing rope has got a bit of stretch with it so that if you fell climbing, you wouldn't get jerked too hard. And so we set up at the top with this overhang, and what we would do with this overhang is let out some rope and then jump over, a little bit like a mini bungee jump. When it came to my mate's turn, he made a great show of pulling out loads and loads of rope, and we said, no, that's enough. But he ignored it, and he kept on pulling out more rope, and he jumped, and he fell, and he kept falling and falling. And we really thought he'd pulled out so much he was just about to hit the ground. Fortunately, just before hitting the ground, the rope stopped him. But he hadn't measured it. If he had only let half a metre more, he'd have been dead. For all of his book smarts, he was deeply foolish. Psalm 14 verse 1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." But if we look at the world's most outspoken atheists, we see that they're really smart. They would absolutely wipe the floor with me in a debate. And among your workmates, probably the most respected, rarely acknowledge God. And they don't look like fools, do they? I often listen to the Rest is Politics Leaders podcast, which has interviews with world-shaping figures, people who have stopped wars and transformed nations, magnificent minds, mostly atheists. But you'll notice that Psalm 14 verse 1 doesn't say, "The fool says in their mind, there is no God." No, it says the fool says in their heart, there is no God. And that's different. You don't even have to deny God intellectually to be that kind of fool. You see, we humans seem perfectly capable of acknowledging God's existence while at the same time acting as if he's irrelevant to our actual lives. So we find in 1 Samuel 13 verse 13, Samuel will sound harsh to our ears when he calls Saul a fool, because Saul's actions seem to us so very reasonable. We might say, if I was in his place, I think I'd do the same thing. And that is exactly what the narrator wants us to think. Remember, friends, this is the first real story of Saul as king. And you will have noticed, as it was read, or maybe in your own reading, if you're listening to this later on, that the version like the English Standard Version, the ESV, is different from other translations like the NIV. The ESV says, Saul was 1 year old when he became king, and he reigned for 2 years. Now, because 1 year old doesn't really fit what we've been reading so far, and 2 years is far shorter than Saul was actually on the throne, translations like the NIV assume that there was an error in the Hebrew text and they fill in the numbers that seem to fit better. But I think it's quite possible and even likely that the narrator is measuring time differently. The narrator is measuring the time from when Saul was anointed king to when he was recognized king, being 1 year. And he's doing that because Saul was the very first king of Israel. He was never born to be king in the same way as other kings are, and so his kingship shouldn't be measured from his birth. And the time between his public recognition as king of the kingdom and his rejection by God as king, which is in this story of chapter 13 to 15, that is a period of 2 short years. And so as we step into these chapters 13 to 15 in this beginning, know this: the story of Israel's first king, the king they had asked for so they could be like the nations, will not be all that they hoped for. And in verse 2 to verse 7, we start with a fearful task. Israel's elders had asked for a king to be like the nations so that they could have someone go out before them and fight their battles. That was the language of 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 20. So it's fitting that the very first account of Saul's reign is a military one. The eastern threat has been dealt with, we saw that in the last couple of weeks, but the Philistines to the west, they remain a problem. They were even mentioned when Saul was anointed in 1 Samuel 9. They'd even have garrisons as far into the nation as Saul's hometown in chapter 10, verse 7. But so far, Saul has done nothing about them. Finally, he acts. Back in chapter 10, Saul had been given 2 key instructions. In verses 7 and 8 of that chapter, he was told, "Now, when these signs meet you, do what your hand finds for you to do, for God is with you. Then go down before me to Gilgal. And behold, I'm coming down to you to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come and show you what to do." In that little section in chapter 10, there were 2 things that Saul should have done. First of all, do what your hand finds you to do. That meant attack the Philistine garrison at Gibeah. And secondly, he was to go to Gilgal and then wait for further instructions for 7 days. Now, since that instruction came, a whole year has passed, and Saul has done neither of those things. Finally, we find in verse 2, Saul moves. He chooses 3,000 men of Israel, 2,000 with Saul at Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, everyone to his own tent. Here we meet Jonathan, who later in this story, in verse 16, is revealed to be Saul's son. And so Saul sets up at this place called Michmash, strategically positioned west of the Philistine garrisons. It sits in the hills. It's overlooking a deep valley that runs down to the Jordan River. About the same distance from both Bethel, which is Samuel's hometown in his base, and Gibeah, which was Saul's home. And so, with his troops in place, the asked-for king is finally ready to do what the people had asked for and what God had anointed him for. And the conflict begins. Notice that as the conflict begins, it's not Saul who's doing the fighting, but Jonathan. Verse 3, Jonathan defeated the garrisons of the Philistines that was at Geba. It's probably another name for Gibeah, which is Saul's hometown, where those garrisons were that he had not yet attacked, and finally they're attacked by his sons, and the Philistines heard of it. It's a fairly small-scale battle. Did Saul know about it, or was Jonathan acting on his own? We're not exactly sure, but one thing's clear, the Philistines heard, and that can't be good. Suddenly the scene shifts to Saul in the second half of verse 13. Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." The Philistines have heard, it's time for the Hebrews to hear. But isn't it interesting, in this call for arms, the word Hebrews is used, the word Hebrews rather than Israel. Hebrews was the term that Israel's enemies used for them. Perhaps they'd started seeing themselves like their enemies did, like slaves, like they were in Egypt under Pharaoh. Those Hebrews, we find out later that the Philistines thought of them like that as well, in the way that we hear about Israel not being allowed to have any blacksmiths among them and having to go to their enemies to get any metal work done. We read on in verse 4, all Israel heard of it and said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines, and the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. Jonathan's victory is credited to Saul here. After all, it was the battle that Saul should have fought. But what's the result? Well, Israel's been noticed like a bad smell, and the Philistines won't ignore it. Saul then calls to the people at Gilgal, which is a bit of an odd choice. It's further east, away from the Philistines. Of course, it is where they have just renewed the kingdom in chapter 11. But more significantly, it is the location where God had instructed Saul to wait for Samuel after his first confrontation with the Philistines, as described in chapter 10, verse 8. Saul remembers the instruction he was given. But so far, have you noticed how passive he has been in this story? Jonathan was the one who fought the battle, and even the call to gather at Gilgal seems to have come from someone else that sit in a passive tense. The asked-for king, is he going to finally take some action? Well, we find in verse 5 he's got 3,000 hand-picked men, and positioned in the hills, they're waiting for the Philistine reaction. The Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen and troops, like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped at Michmash, to the east of Beth Aven. The Philistines have a massive force, 10 times as many chariots as Israel has soldiers, 2 times as many horsemen, and foot soldiers there beyond counting. And worse, they've occupied this place called Michmash, the very place that Saul has just left. It's a terrifying start to Saul's reign as a military leader. And Israel, verse 6, is terrified. When they saw they're in trouble, for the people were hard-pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. They have stirred up a hornet's nest, and now they're panicking. The people are once again called Hebrews, a reminder of how the Philistines see them and maybe how they see themselves. They agree, it seems, with the Philistine assessment of the situation. I mean, some hide, others flee east across the Jordan to Gad and Gilead. That way that they had come into the land under Moses and then Joshua, they were now using to head back. They're heading back into the wilderness. But at least Saul stays. He holds his ground at Gilgal, just as Samuel had instructed. That's looking very king-like, and just in time, you might think. A few are still following him, but they're shaking with fear. The pressure is mounting. What will Saul do next? Well, from verse 8 to 15, we find how he acts in this fearful situation. And Saul so far is still doing what he has been instructed to do by God's prophet. He was instructed to wait 7 days, the day appointed by Samuel. And Saul waits. Each day, however, the Philistine army is growing stronger. His own troops, however, are growing restless. Why are we just sitting here? They're getting stronger every minute. Where is Samuel? Has anyone seen him? Every hour feels like an eternity, but Saul waits. He waits all 7 days and still no Samuel. And his army, chapter 13, verse 9, is scattering. And so in that scattering situation, in that verse, Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. In this desperate situation, Saul takes matters into his own hands. These sacrifices were meant to seek God's favour, but they weren't his to offer. But what choice does he have? The enemy is growing, his army is vanishing. Surely a kingly thing to do is to act. Surely leadership means taking initiative, and so that's what he does. And at that very moment, verse 10, as soon as he'd offered the offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Relief! Finally, the prophet's arrived. But the relief is short-lived, isn't it? Verse 11, Samuel says, "What have you done?" We who know our Bibles well will recognise that kind of a phrase. They're the same words that were spoken in Eden just after Adam and Eve disobeyed God in Genesis 3 verse 13. The same words were spoken to Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verse 10, just after he had murdered his brother. The same words were spoken to Achan, whose sin had brought judgment on Israel, just as they were entering into the land. And now these words are spoken to Saul. Samuel answers, "What have you done?" Saul says, verse 11, "When I saw the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favour of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. I didn't have a choice. The people were abandoning me. You were nowhere to be found. The Philistines were getting stronger. I had to do something. I didn't want to, but I had to force myself to do it," says Saul. But Samuel, there's no sympathy there. Verse 13, "You have done foolishly." Wait, foolishly? What was Saul supposed to do? Wasn't it better than to sit and wait? Wasn't it better to actually do something? Wouldn't doing nothing have been truly the foolish thing? But Samuel's very blunt. "You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you." And only a fool would do something like that. Now, friends, does that sound harsh? Because it does to my ears. Just look again at the situation. Surely Saul was in an impossible one. Surely to wait further would have meant going against everything a king should do. All the evidence demanded that Saul take a lead. Before the enemy army grew any further than it was already, and before his own army got any smaller, all logic said, take action. And in this, we should see how naive it is to think that trusting God is easy, as if trusting God was a simple thing to do. Those people who accuse believers as being people who are hanging on to a faith like it was a security blanket for people who can't face reality, they just don't understand how difficult faith is, do they? The foolishness of the heart described in Psalm 14 cannot be judged by just looking at the situation. In fact, most of the time, trusting God is what looks to the world like foolishness. Friends, the foolishness of disobeying God is only something that we can see clearly when we know something apart from what our senses tell us, and from what our wisdom might tell us, and from what our perception of the situation can tell us. See, if Saul had devoted himself to trust against the evidence, what would have happened? Well, if he had trusted against all the evidence, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, says verse 13. What made Saul's decision foolish wasn't the pressure. It wasn't the size of the Philistines. It wasn't even his fear for his men. What made Saul's decision foolish was that God had spoken and Saul did not believe it. God had spoken and Saul had not obeyed. And that, dear friends, has consequences. Verse 14, "Now your kingdom, Saul, shall not continue." Obedience is essential for the one who leads God's people. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Saul's reign isn't ending that day, but his dynasty is, because the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. Now, that phrase is quite well known among Christians, and people usually take it to mean that God has chosen a particularly godly person. But that is not it at all, because the focus of the phrase is not on the man's heart. No, the focus of that phrase is on God's heart. God will set his heart on another to be king. Not a king chosen by the heart of the people, but a king chosen by the heart of God. This is a moment that is setting the stage for what is to come in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But for now, the king the people demanded so that they could be like the nations is rejected. Yes, God had overruled the process, maintaining his rule even over the king of his people, but Saul will not be the one to establish a lasting kingdom. But the Philistines are still there, an ever-growing army. Verse 15, and Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army, and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. He had started with 3,000, now he's down to 600, and yet the Philistines are still massing, the battle is still coming. The scene is set. Israel camps at Geba. The Philistines, an overwhelming foe, they're camped at Michmash, a deep ravine separating them. Israel can see the enemy movements in verses 16 to 18, but they are powerless to act. The Philistines escalate their strategy. They send out raiding parties in multiple directions, north towards Ophrah, west toward Beth Horon, and east toward the valley of Zeboim, near the wilderness. Israel is surrounded, Saul is outnumbered, but we now learn that it is even worse. Verse 19, there's no blacksmith to be found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, let the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, or his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the ploughshares, and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. We're in a situation where the Philistines have complete control of the means of production. Israel is not allowed to have any blacksmiths. They're not able to make their own weapons. Even their farming tools, they must purchase from and have sharpened by the Philistine blacksmiths. The threat they have is more than a military threat. Israel's very existence seems to lie in the Philistines' hands. They can't fight, they can't even farm without the Philistines letting them. That's how bad the situation is. The enemy controls the land, the enemy controls the economy, the enemy controls the weapons. And the battle looms in verses 22 and 23, and we have it in devastating detail. Verse 22, on the day of the battle there was neither a sword nor a spear to be found in the hand of any of the people, with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. This tiny Israelite force is essentially unarmed, whereas the mighty Philistine army ready for war with chariots and horses. The Israelites, they've got farm tools. Apart from Saul and Jonathan, well, they've got swords. This isn't just bad, it's a disaster. And then the garrison of the Philistines, we read, went out of the pass of Michmash. The battle's coming. How on earth can Israel possibly survive? To be continued. But what can we take from this chapter? Well, we've seen things from a perspective that makes complete sense to us. A tiny army facing a massive one. Samuel running late. What if he never shows? Something has to be done. And that classic line, better to say sorry for doing nothing. Maybe that's what. Better to ask forgiveness rather than permission. Maybe that's what Saul had in his mind. But that's the problem, isn't it? The problem is that we are so much like Saul that sounds logical. We trust our logic, we trust our situation, we trust our perception of our circumstances, we trust our own eyes far more than we trust God's clear word to us. That's the kind of trust that God asks for. It's a kind of trust that is beyond us. Saul couldn't save his people, he was a fool, but that means he's just like me. A fool like you too. And that's exactly why we need to heed these words that we get from the New Testament book of Hebrews. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. See, Saul wasn't the king God's people needed. No, God's people need a king who would trust the Father completely, in a way that Saul did not, and in a way that we do not. And that king, friends, has come. King Jesus. He was not a fool, not according to God's eyes. He was not a fool when he was hanging on the cross. He was not a fool as they were mocking him and saying things like, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we might see and believe." No, he was not a fool. He stayed on the cross. Peter, who knew him personally, travelling with him for 3 years, he wrote that he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. That's the kind of king God's people need. So what do fools like us do? Well, we act like the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.